there, and it says he kept him there basically at the pleasure of the Jews. That is, he was not going to let him go. Then we see that Festus takes the position of Felix. And now Festus has apparently been in Jerusalem. The Jews at Jerusalem are saying, well, bring him down here to Jerusalem. Let us have a sort of a judgment scene here, and let us try Paul down here. Let us ask him some more of these questions about what's going on. And Felix says, no, he needs to be kept at Caesarea. Acts chapter 25, verse 4. And that he was going to himself, Festus, would depart shortly and go back to Caesarea from Jerusalem. And he says, if there are those, verse 5, who are able to go down with me and accuse this man by some wickedness that he's done, then you come along with me, and we'll go to Caesarea. And when he had tarried among them more than 10 days, he went down to Caesarea, and the next day, sitting on the judgment seat, commanded Paul to be brought. And when he was come, the Jews which came down from Jerusalem stood round about and had many and grievous complaints against Paul. Now, we talked about these, many and grievous. What's Paul done? Well, Paul finally gets answer for himself and makes a defense. He says, I haven't done anything against the law of the Jews, verse 8, neither against the temple, and nothing against Caesar. They had accused Paul of just breaking every law possible. Well, where are the specifics? What has he done? And they had nothing to really answer. They just were saying that he'd broken all these laws. Festus, verse 9, willing to do the Jews a pleasure, that is, desiring to gain favor with the Jews, answered Paul and said, wilt thou go down to Jerusalem and there be judged of these things before men? So, I mean, here you have this situation. Festus, no doubt, has been probably informed by Felix, I can't find anything wrong with this man. I could just let him go just as soon as keep him. But because I wanted to be in good standing with the Jews, I've kept him. And I'm sure that was conveyed to Festus. Now here's Festus. He's hearing these accusations against Paul. Paul saying, haven't broken the law of the Jews, haven't broken the laws of the temple, haven't broken the laws of the land, haven't done anything. And so here's Festus saying, well, okay, what am I going to do with this man? Well, knowing that the Jews want him to go back to Jerusalem to stand trial. And we know the ulterior motives for the Jews wanting him to go down there. It's not to stand trial, it's so they can kill him. Festus is trying to see if he can get something out of this situation from a political standpoint that will make him in good standing with the Jews. So, Paul, how about going back down to Jerusalem? And Paul says, no, I'm not going to have any part of that. Verse 10. Then said Paul, I stand at Caesar's judgment seat. That is, he's standing at someone who's a governor under the authority of the Roman government, and therefore they represent Caesar. He says, I'm not going to go back and be under the auspices or the governance of the Jewish people in Jerusalem. That's not what I want to do. He says, I stand at Caesar's judgment seat where I ought to be judged. I'm where I need to be. To the Jews I have done no wrong, as thou well knowest. So the point here is that in all the discussion that's taking place, and obviously this is not a quick discussion. Festus doesn't come in and say, well, the Jews said this against you, and Paul says, no, it's not true. That's not how simple it was. Believe me. That we can't, it's not possible to have everything that was brought to bear in writing. And it's not really necessary for us. We have what we need in the Scriptures. We don't have every detail of every event. Could you imagine how massive that would be? And so there's stuff that's going on here beyond just a quick conversation. You're guilty? No, I'm not guilty in the story. Paul has made known. And you know Paul, in all the times that we have seen him in the synagogues and before people, his defense is pretty impeccable. He's not going to just throw something out there. Paul is going to give you every detail of why he's not guilty. And so that's going on here. Festus knows he has no case against Paul. And so he says, you know I've done no wrong. You know it well. You know I haven't done anything wrong. For he says, if I be an offender or have committed anything worthy of death, I'm not refusing to die. He says, I refuse not to die. If I have done something to break the law and I need to be put to death, I can accept that. But he says that's not the case. But if there be none of these things whereof they accuse me, no man may deliver me unto them. I appeal unto Caesar. I want Caesar to make the decision. It's apparent that Felix and Festus don't want to make the decision. And so they're caught in this quandary of what to do with him. And Paul says, well, no, I'm not going back to Jerusalem. I want to go and be tried by Caesar, or judged by Caesar. And Festus then, when he had conferred with the council, answered, hast thou appealed unto Caesar? Unto Caesar thou shalt go. And after certain days, King Agrippa and Bernice came into Caesarea to salute Festus. And when he had been there many days, Festus declared Paul's cause unto the king, saying, there is a certain man left in bonds by Felix, about whom, when I was at Jerusalem, the chief priests and the elders of the Jews informed me, desiring to have judgment against him. So I know about this man, know what he's done. The Jews have told me what he's done. I've heard Paul's defenses. And he gives the story to Agrippa. He says, to whom I answered, it is not the manner of the Romans to deliver any man to die before that he which is accused have the accusers face to face and have opportunity or license to answer for himself concerning the crimes laid against him. All this is taking place. It's all taking place. The stage is being set once again. And political move or whatever, we're going to see this played out one more time. We've had it done with Felix. We've had it done with Festus. Now Festus is saying, I've heard both sides of the story, and from a political standpoint, the king would have been someone who had a little bit more power than a governor of the region. And so he says, maybe now it's time for you to hear and make a decision. And so he says, therefore, when they were come hither without any delay on the morrow, I sat on the judgment seat and commanded this man to be brought forth. Against whom, this is Festus giving his story to Agrippa of what's happened. Against whom, when the accusers stood up, they brought none accusations of such things as I supposed. Here's a man who sits in judgment over the things in his region all the time. Now, what you would expect someone to come in and say? Well, somebody's killed somebody, somebody's stolen from somebody, somebody's done this or that. That's the kind of thing he's expecting to hear. He says, I haven't heard anything of what I expected to hear. So he says, I'm a little bit taken aback at the things that they're accusing him of. Verse 19, but had certain questions against him of their own superstition or religion, and of one Jesus, which was dead, whom Paul affirmed to be alive. That's just a whole marvelous story there in itself. I mean, if you stop and look at what appears to be as a basis for this, let me say, rub that's going on between the Jews and Paul, are things that are so documented and known by the Jews, which many of them have recognized what had been done based on the sermons that were taught on the day of Pentecost by the apostles and all the people there that were convinced that they had crucified the Son of God and said, "Men and brethren, what shall we do?" And of course, the change that took place in those people, the establishment of the church and the spreading of the gospel, which tells us about Jesus' resurrection from the dead. So you have these Jews who basically, from what we can see in the Scriptures, and we've looked at this over multiple chapters now in the book of Acts, who are intent on, even knowing the stories and knowing people that have been obedient to the gospel, no doubt, maybe even within their own families, have the intent of not accepting the historical facts that go along with the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. The witnessing of Him being alive after His death, the ascension, at least the stories of His ascension into heaven, and then the establishment of this group, the Way, that is spreading through all the land, which they take offense to. There's just a big story here. This Jesus that they're talking about talked again and again in front of these dignitaries about His resurrection from the dead, that they say didn't happen. He's not the Son of God. And Paul, who's affirming that Jesus is the Anointed One, Jesus is the Christ. That confrontation is what is being brought into question here. It's not really about what Paul has done. It's what he's teaching, and they don't want to hear it. And so they are at issue with Paul, and not knowing how to deal with it, they will throw anything they can at Paul to say he's done all these things. He's violated all these laws. But yet, when asked to show the evidence of what Paul has done, so that he might be accused and judged, they don't have the evidence. But here's the real rub, is the fact that Jesus has arisen from the grave, and that He is the Son of God. And that's why they have such a problem. And so Festus tells Agrippa, it's about this. It's about this one Jesus who was dead and who Paul affirms to be alive. How do you deal with that? And because I doubted of such a manner of questions, he says, the American Standard here says, I being perplexed how to inquire concerning these things, I asked him whether he would go to Jerusalem and there be judged to these matters. Now, how is it going to be any clearer whether the accusers come to Caesarea or if Festus goes to Jerusalem with Paul? How's that going to answer the questions any better? It's just not. But that's what he's throwing out here. I just didn't know how to answer these questions, and so I said, well, maybe we need to go to Jerusalem. But when Paul had appealed to be reserved unto the hearing of Augustus, the emperor, I commanded him to be kept till I might send him to Caesar. Then Agrippa said unto Festus, I would also hear the man myself. Tomorrow, said he, thou shalt hear him. And on the morrow, when Agrippa was come in Bernice with great pomp, and entered into the place of hearing. Now you can imagine, this is a king. And he's already there in Caesarea. He has already made his visit and appearance to Festus. But here's going to be this hearing. Apparently would be a hearing that would be somewhat public. And so we've got to have the king come in great pomp. So he's come in and he's entered into the place of hearing with the chief captains, and principal men of the city, at Festus' commandment, Paul was brought forth. And Festus said, King Agrippa, and all men which are here present with us, you see this man, about whom all the multitude of the Jews have dealt with me, both at Jerusalem and also here, crying that he ought not to live any longer. And when you talk like that, you come back to the basis. What has the man done? Why is it that this man should not live any longer? And when you say that the real basis is the fact that he's teaching this Jesus who was killed, who was dead, and Paul affirms to be alive, I could see the Roman government saying, what is this? You know, who's ever heard of such a thing, to be someone to be put forth that needing to be put to death for something like this? It's probably just, really perplexing them. Why? And so he says that they're saying he should not live any longer. Verse 25, but when I found that he had committed nothing worthy of death, nothing. Okay, you want him put to death. What has he done? Well, he's sort of been stirring up trouble. What did he do? Well, he's been teaching about this Jesus, that he was crucified, or he was put to death, but he's alive now. Why is that bothering you so much? Why is that something worthy of death? So they don't have anything. But when I found that he had committed nothing worthy of death, and that he himself hath appealed to Augustus, I determined to send him, of whom I have no certain thing to write unto my Lord. Wherefore I have brought him forth before you, and especially before thee, O King Agrippa, that after examination I might have somewhat to write. Hey, I can't just send this man to Caesar. What am I going to write to Caesar? He has this belief that this man is alive after he was dead.
Festus is saying, I had Paul brought to me with several companies worth of men to protect him along the way, because the Jews were going to kill him. Heard what he had to say, didn't know what to do with him. Tried to get some money from him. Apparently, Paul was either broke or refused to give him money. Anyway, didn't get any money. And then Festus knew the Jews said, hey, bring him back to Jerusalem, because they said, it looks like openly, we're going to try to kill him again. And so now Festus is trying to act all legalistic, if you will, following the Roman law in front of Agrippa. Agrippa, later on, we're going to see, is like, hey man, you could have cut this guy loose had he not. And then coming back around, Festus says, I don't know what to do with him, except he wanted to go to Caesar. And the whole time he's kind of hiding the fact that I'm the one that wanted to say, let's send him back to Jerusalem. And I wonder, I said all that to say this, I wonder what would have happened had he sent him to Jerusalem, exposed him to the Jews along the way. I guess he probably would have sent 2 or 3 soldiers, easy to get killed. And it just shows what kind of a guy really Festus is. Worried about politics, worried about personal finance.
The idea of because everything, all the indications are that he was in good with the Jews. He would have probably sent a small garrison, or whatever the term would be, of soldiers to go down with him. It wouldn't be much, just something sort of accompanying on the way back. And obviously, what would have happened to Paul? I mean, I think it'd be, when you have the story as we unfolded it, 40 men who have vowed not to eat or drink or anything until they have killed Paul. Now, obviously, we look at this, and we've talked about the previous chapter, that it appears that there was a 2-year period there. So obviously they can go through that not eating and drinking for 2 years. But the point is they probably hadn't changed. I mean, their mentality is if we see Paul, we're going to kill him. And when I look at this, it's not a big thing really for Festus to send a few soldiers and send him back to Jerusalem. It's just not a big thing. I mean, you know, there's not anything that's really criminal that I can make a decision about. And if the Jews really want him to come back to Jerusalem and to be tried there, what's the problem? What's the big deal? Let's just send him back down there. And what I see in this is the providence of God. Because had Paul, I believe with all my heart, had Paul been sent back, it's like Steve said, he probably would have been sent back with just a small group of soldiers, not like he came up to Caesarea with, and they would have killed him. And had Paul been killed, it would have been a great blow to the church. Because look at what Paul has accomplished from the standpoint of once he goes to Rome. It is no secret if you look at the scriptures that Paul was constantly teaching in the prison. No doubt most of the soldiers that were associated with the prison knew the details of the gospel. Now, they may not have accepted them, but he taught. He didn't go up there in isolation and say, well, I'm locked up, I can't do anything. He taught the people in the prison. And not only that, he wrote a lot of letters while he was in prison. So if you look at what we have in terms of the New Testament and the writings of Paul, and the activity that Paul was engaged to up until this point, there's not a real indication he had a lot of time to write letters. But in prison he did. Just look at the providence of God, though. The providence of God keeps Paul here. Here's a simple decision that could have sent him back to Jerusalem that would have taken his life. It didn't happen. And being in the quandary and the way Paul worked this, it says, I am a Roman citizen and I have the right to appeal to Caesar. That helped protect him and send him on to Rome. It's just, there's a lot of stuff going on in these stories.
Agrippa, who we'll find out to be, is not a dumb man. He believes in the process of law, which, I mean, you got to, I guess, hand that to the Romans, at least back then, that they did do that. And I always thought about Agrippa. I don't know if he ever obeyed the gospel. I mean, it doesn't really say that he did. But he's kind of like Gamaliel, where you secretly root for people to do that because they present themselves as, as fair people. So it also shows, I guess, the gospel can convert anybody.
Yep. And even when it doesn't convert somebody, it influences them.
Right.
And that's an amazing thing. So, he says, I really just don't know what to do with him. And so I've got to write something to Caesar and say, here's why I'm sending him to you. And the indication we always get from the Roman emperors is they're going to frown and be somewhat upset if someone just shows up and say, here's somebody that what do you say? Here's somebody that has appealed to Caesar, needs to be judged, and oh, by the way, I couldn't take care of it in my position. I mean, what do you write to the emperor? Are you going to tell him that you could not come to judgment on this? That's an embarrassing thing. And so you need to have something to write down that says, this is why it really had to come to you as the emperor. This is why you needed to do it. Now, when you look at Claudius Lysias, and as he wrote letters to Felix, you can understand. He's saying, there's a turmoil here. I'm not really sitting in judgment. I'm here to keep the peace in this area in Jerusalem. I'm not here to render judgment. That was what Felix was supposed to do. And so, legitimately, Claudius Lysias could say, here, I'm sending him to you. But when you start talking about Festus and having to write letters to Augustus, what do you say? And so he says, Agrippa, you need to hear this man, because I don't even know what to write to Caesar about. I don't know what to send along with him when I send him to Rome. So continuing in verse 27, for it seemeth to me unreasonable to send a prisoner, and not withal to signify the crimes laid against him. I'm not going to send a prisoner to Rome and say, well, I don't know what he's done. I need to tell him what crimes he's committed. And Festus says, I can't find anything. And this is what Paul had defended. He says, you can't find anything because I've not broken the law. I've not done anything that's worthy of death. And so now maybe Agrippa, we'll see what can be done with Agrippa listening to what he has to say. Then Agrippa, chapter 26, then Agrippa said unto Paul, thou art permitted to speak for thyself. Then Paul stretched forth the hand, and answered for himself. I think myself happy, King Agrippa, because I shall answer for myself this day before thee, touching all things whereof I am accused of the Jews. Now that is just, if you look at that, that's typical Paul. Paul will not skirt any issue that's been brought against him. He says, I'm going to speak for myself, and I am going to address all things whereof I'm accused of the Jews. And knowing Paul, he's not going to leave anything out. You say, you want to talk about me violating the temple? Let's talk about that. You want to talk about me violating the laws of the Jews? Let's talk about that. You want to talk about me breaking the laws of the land? Let's talk about that. He was going to address everything that had been brought against him. And knowing Paul, he's not going to leave anything out. And he's happy to be able to make his defense. He says, especially am I happy to be able to do this, verse 3, because I know thee to be an expert in all customs and questions which are among the Jews, whereof I beseech thee to hear me patiently. Now, is Paul trying to butter up Agrippa? I don't know. I don't really think so. I think he maybe had heard of Agrippa's reputation, that he was well versed in the ways of the Jews, because we're going to see this a little bit later, where he says, King Agrippa, you believe the prophets? I know you believe. Well, you have to have some basis for saying that. It's just not an emotional feeling. Well, you know, Agrippa, I just sort of feel like you're a man that's in touch with what's going on. No, I think Paul had some evidence. Someone who had talked about Agrippa before and how Agrippa was well versed in some things. So I don't think Paul's buttering up. He's not that type. That's just not Paul. And I think Paul's just stating the facts here. He says, I know that you are an expert in all customs and questions which are among the Jews. And so he says, I beg you to hear me patiently. And that's a way of saying, some of you may have experienced this in your working relationship. If you ever had to make any presentations, one of the hardest things to do in making a presentation is when you have managers or high-ranking officials in the room with you and you start making a point on the chart, and if they happen to have the charts in their hands, well, you know, you're on chart 1, they're over here, what's this over here on chart 3? So, well, I will get to that. Or they start just bombarding your presentation because you can't even get off page 1 sometimes. And so I think this is Paul's way of saying, and what typically do, you get taught as a presenter, you say, well, if you'll allow me to answer questions after I've done my presentation, I'll be happy to do that. So we try to curtail some of that stuff. Well, I think that's what Paul's doing. You know, I'm going to say some things that are probably going to have Agrippa sort of like, you know, wait a minute, let's talk about that, or, you know, I want to go down a rabbit trail when you bring up that topic. And so, what's Paul done at every situation here in the last little bit in Acts? What has he done when he's gotten the opportunity? Gone back to the start of it. I persecuted the Christians. I was going to Damascus with papers authorizing me to bring people and bind them and bring them and put them in prison. And then something happened on the road to Damascus. And here's what happened. And here's what I went through. And here's what I've started doing. Every time we see Paul making a defense, he goes back to the very beginning. Because Paul has to explain, we talked about this, Paul has to explain to how he got from point A to point B. And he tells them, but Paul, you were a devout Jew. You were basically almost dogmatic in terms of holding on to the law of Moses and doing everything that was associated with that. How did you get to a point to where now you believe in the Christ? And that what he has to say and how that he has fulfilled the law of Moses. How did you get there? And so Paul tells the whole story, and that's really the only way you can do it. And so I think what we're going to see here is Paul appealing to Agrippa and saying, please be patient with me. I'm going to talk about a lot of things, but I'm going to get to where I need to be. Okay? So don't necessarily interrupt me along the way. Be patient in my presentation here. Let me speak of what I have to speak about. Verse 4, my manner of life from my youth. And, you know, you look at this and you say, oh, we're going back to his childhood. You know, it's going to be a long story. My manner of life from my youth, which was at first among mine own nation at Jerusalem, know all the Jews. They know me. I grew up in the presence of all these people. They know me. They know who I am. They know my background. They know my education. They know what I believed in. And so this is not something that's new to them. My youth is known by all the Jews, which knew me from the beginning, if they would testify that after the most straightest sect of our religion, I lived a Pharisee. They know this. And if they would testify without being biased or trying to convey what they want to be heard, they would say that this is who I am, or this is who I was. And now I stand and am judged for the hope of the promise made of God unto our fathers. Now, I do find this interesting. As we've said, we really believe that Agrippa knows about the Jews. And when Paul makes argument here, as he makes his delivery to Agrippa, notice what he brings up. He brings up the promise that God made unto the fathers. Now, quite frankly, and this is just me talking, I believe this would have been wasted on Felix and Festus. Don't know anything about it. But I really believe Agrippa knew the ways of the Jews. He knew of the promise that was made to their fathers, and upon which the Jews always stood and pointed back to. And that's where we hear phrases in the New Testament about the Jews saying, we're Abraham's children, for example. What does that mean? We're the children of promise. God made promise to Abraham. Of course, he made That carried on out with the other fathers of the nation of the Jews. But that's some of the terminology we see. So I think Agrippa knew this. I think Paul is rehearsing with him the things that he's aware of. And so he says, I'm being judged for the hope of the promise made of God unto our fathers. Now, you read that sentence right there and you just sort of say, okay, all right. God made a promise to the fathers. That's a known fact. That's something that the Jews stand on. But look at what Paul says. I stand and am judged for the hope of the promise that's been made unto our fathers. Paul is going to lead Agrippa down the path and to lay in front of him these steps of biblical truth that's going to lead him to understand at the end of this discussion that Jesus is the fulfillment of the promises that were made unto Abraham. And although the Jews that are in the audience or have been around accusing Paul, don't want to make that logical and well-presented stepping stone approach to get to where Paul is, Agrippa is going to listen intently to it. That's important because that's where Paul's headed. It's not Paul just standing up here and just talking for 2 hours about something. He is going to lay it out so that no one can misunderstand what's happened from the promise that was made until the fulfillment of the promises in Jesus Christ.
Doing this, he knows Agrippa would hammer him.
Yeah.
If they made a sound.
Yeah. This is an opportunity he's going to take advantage of because he knows he has the floor. He's been given it to by this authority, the king. Obviously, they have paid a lot of attention to him coming into the city, and they know his position. And there are things you just don't do in the presence of the king. You just don't do that. And that speaking out would be one of them. So he has an opportunity here to talk about what he needs to talk about. Verse 7, unto which promise our 12 tribes instantly or earnestly serving God day and night hope to come. We were looking for something. We were hoping for something. That's what was driving us. There was a promise that we would receive blessings if we continue to be the children of God. Looking for a time when blessings would come, when our hope would be seen and revealed. And he says, our 12 tribes, we're serving God every day, hoping that this would come. He says, for which hope's sake, King Agrippa, I am accused of the Jews. We're getting back. He's not saying anything about Jesus. He's not saying anything about the... He's gone back to the very beginning. He's talking about the hope, the promises that were made. He says, I'm still holding on to this hope. That's why I'm being accused of the Jews. It's this hope that goes back hundreds and thousands of years that was made to our forefathers. And he's going to lay it all out in great detail. This is what I'm being accused. But he ties it in to what's happening right now. I'm being accused of something that has a string or thread all the way back to the promises made to our fathers. So next week, let's see, what is next week? Meeting week. 2 weeks from now, I guess, we'll get back here and we'll see what else is presented to Agrippa. Go ahead and be filling in your blanks in your workbooks for chapters 14 or 15 through 28. That'll be coming up pretty soon. Thanks for being here.